He was a 17-year-old boy who thought he could get away with anything. In a quiet suburban town, Ethan Walker would commit a crime so brutal that it would shatter everything. His family, his future, and the very community he thought he could control. But what happens when the person closest to him, the one who thought she could protect him, finally sees him for who he truly is? Stay tuned to hear the chilling, heartbreaking story of how a young man's arrogance led to a tragedy that no one saw coming. Before we dive into today's story, I want to ask for a little help from you. As a new storyteller, your support means everything. If you enjoy the story, please hit that like button, subscribe, and share your location in the comments below. It's a simple gesture that helps me grow, and I'd love to know where you're watching from. Let's make this journey together. The peaceful town of Westfield. Westfield was the kind of town that felt as though it belonged to a different time. The air was crisp, the kind of crisp that hinted at the arrival of fall. Streets lined with tall oak trees, their leaves painted in shades of amber and gold, stretched out in all directions. The occasional rustle of leaves being swept by the wind echoed through the streets, mingling with the distant hum of life. Here, on these quiet suburban roads, people lived in harmony. Neighbors waved to each other, children rode their bikes without a care, and the schools had that special familiarity where everyone knew everyone else's name. The town square, the heart of Westfield, was the pride of the community. A large fountain stood at the center, with iron benches surrounding it for those seeking to take a moment of reflection. In the late afternoons, the streets were bustling with families finishing their errands, running into each other in the corner cafe, or sitting on porches, enjoying the setting sun. There was a sense of safety, a sense that nothing could disrupt the serene balance of this place. Among the many houses lining Westfield streets, one stood out for its warmth and welcoming nature. The Holloway family home, nestled on Maple Creek Lane. The house was a two-story structure with white paint that gleamed in the sunlight and a large porch where John Holloway, a high school history teacher, often sat in a rocking chair, reading or simply watching the world go by. It was the kind of place that seemed to offer nothing but peace, yet as the night settled in, that peace would be violently shattered, revealing a darkness none could have foreseen. The Holloway family, a portrait of normalcy. John Holloway, 52, was a man of quiet habits. His life was built on routine, both in his personal and professional world. For over 2 decades, he had taught history at Westfield High, shaping the minds of young students who would one day leave the town for bigger cities, but always remembering the teacher who brought history to life. He had a reputation for being gentle but firm, a man who believed in teaching not just facts, but values. His students loved him, and his colleagues respected him. He was the type of teacher who stayed after class to help students with their problems, and found time to help a neighbor with a leaky roof or an overgrown garden. John's family was just as ordinary, though in the best possible way. His wife, Rebecca, was a stay-at-home mother who spent her days managing the household and caring for their daughter, Lily, a bright-eyed 9-year-old with a curiosity that seemed insatiable. Lily, despite her youth, had a maturity beyond her years, perhaps from the example set by her parents, who fostered an environment of kindness, empathy, and intellectual curiosity. John's life was everything he had ever wanted: peaceful, steady, and filled with purpose. There were no major stresses in his life, no looming troubles, but like many stories that unfold in the dead of night, it would take only a few seconds to unravel everything. A typical evening. The calm before the storm. The evening of October 12th was one of those rare, quiet nights where the stars were clear, and a soft breeze whispered through the trees. The Holloway home was quiet, with the only sound being the occasional chirp of crickets and the low hum of the refrigerator. Inside, Rebecca and Lily were in the kitchen, finishing up the last remnants of their dinner. The smell of garlic and roast vegetables lingered in the air, a comforting aroma of home. John had already finished his meal, retreating to his favorite chair by the window in the living room, where he read the newspaper. A habit that never wavered, the clock on the wall ticked steadily, and for the moment, the only thing out of place was the peaceful stillness of the house. It was the kind of night where nothing extraordinary would happen, the kind of night that signaled the end of a week's work and the beginning of a weekend with no particular plans, just a bit of quiet. relaxation. Rebecca was humming softly to herself, washing the dishes, and Lily was at the table, sketching in her notebook, occasionally looking up at the clock, anticipating the time when she could finally go to bed and leave the day behind. There was no hint of anything unusual, nothing to foreshadow the horror that would soon engulf them. At 9:45 p.m., John stretched in his chair and turned off the lamp next to him, signaling his intent to retire for the night. His eyes met Rebecca's for a brief moment, and she smiled at him. They shared an unspoken communication. The comfortable ease of a long marriage, it wasn't unusual for him to go to bed early, given his routine of early mornings, but tonight, Rebecca would be left alone for a short while, as John would read himself to sleep, the gentle hum of the house lulling him into slumber. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves across the quiet street. The moon was nearly full, casting a soft glow across the neighborhood. Everything seemed ordinary, even serene. But in a moment, that would change forever. A chilling call to 911. At 10:47 p.m., the phone rang at the Westfield Police Department. It was a 911 call. The kind of call that no one ever truly expects. The dispatcher answered quickly, but instead of a clear voice, they heard only a few panicked, broken words from the other side. A woman, terrified, speaking too quickly for her words to be comprehended. Screams, "Please, help my husband, he's dead." The line went silent before the dispatcher could confirm any details. The only thing heard was a faint click, and the silence that followed was deafening. The dispatcher immediately contacted patrol officers and instructed them to head toward the Holloway residence. But even as the call ended, the sense of dread had already begun to settle over the department. In a town like Westfield, such events were few and far between, and when they occurred, they felt as though they carried a weight far heavier than the situation warranted. Within minutes, patrol cars sped down the street, their sirens slicing through the quiet night. The officers arrived at the Holloway home to find everything eerily calm. The porch light was on, and the house was undisturbed in appearance. But as soon as they entered through the front door, they were confronted with a scene of absolute horror. The discovery. John Holloway's body lay lifeless in the living room. Blood was everywhere, splattered across the beige carpet, staining the couch cushions, and soaking into the area rug. His arms were sprawled out, and his eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling in a way that conveyed the terror he had felt in his final moments. A pool of blood surrounded him, and his shirt was torn and stained from a violent struggle. The officers immediately stepped back, their minds racing as they tried to make sense of what had occurred. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that anything had been stolen. Nothing in the house appeared disturbed except for the scene of chaos in the living room. The doors were locked, and nothing seemed out of place in the house except for one thing. John was gone, and he had been murdered. A wave of shock hit the officers as they realized the magnitude of what had occurred. The quiet, peaceful town had just been shattered, and as they began to piece together the fragments of the night, a more troubling question arose. Who could have done such a thing, and why? The investigation begins. The moment the officers crossed the threshold of the Holloway home, they knew they were dealing with something far worse than a simple domestic incident. Officer Sarah Thompson, a seasoned detective with nearly 10 years on the force, immediately took charge of the scene. She had seen her fair share of violence, but this was different. The brutality was chilling, almost incomprehensible as her partner, Officer Mark Davis, began securing the scene and calling in for backup. Sarah's mind was already working, piecing together the few clues that could lead them to the truth. The first thing she noticed was the lack of forced entry. The windows were intact, the door locked securely from the inside. This wasn't a break-in. The perpetrator had been let in, or worse, was already known to the family. She stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the discovery sink in. Her eyes swept over the living room again. The blood, the mess, the violent struggle. John Holloway had fought for his life. That much was clear. But why? And who would want to kill him? Mark, Sarah said, her voice tight with the seriousness of the situation. Start talking to the family. See if anyone saw anything unusual tonight. I'll stay here and start processing the scene. Mark nodded, his face grim. He knew as well as Sarah that the discovery of a body wasn't just the end of one chapter. It was the beginning of a complex investigation that would uncover secrets the Holloways had probably kept hidden for years. The first person Sarah needed to speak to was Rebecca Holloway, John's wife, the one who had called 911. As Sarah made her way upstairs, her steps slow and deliberate, the full weight of the crime pressed down on her chest. She could barely imagine the terror Rebecca must have felt, knowing that her husband was gone, that she was now alone with their young daughter, Lily. Rebecca Holloway, a shattered woman. When Sarah entered the room, she found Rebecca sitting on the edge of their bed, her hands trembling as she clutched a framed photograph of the family. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, as if she hadn't fully processed the enormity of what had happened. The air in the room was thick with the scent of her perfume, mingling with the faint smell of something burning in the kitchen. The dinner she had likely been preparing when the tragedy occurred. The warmth of the house had vanished, replaced by a cold, oppressive silence. Rebecca looked up as Sarah approached, her expression one of disbelief and sorrow. I don't understand," Rebecca whispered, her voice raw, hoarse. "What happened to him? Why would anyone hurt John?" Sarah took a deep breath, her training kicking in. "Rebecca, I need you to stay calm. I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions. Did you hear anything unusual tonight? Did anyone visit the house? Did you have any problems with anyone recently?" Rebecca shook her head slowly, her eyes unfocused. "No, nothing. We were just at home, like any other night. John was reading his paper. Lily was in her room. I was in the kitchen. I don't know what happened. I didn't hear anything. And then, I just saw him." Her voice cracked as she trailed off, overwhelmed by emotion. Sarah placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer comfort. Though she knew it was only temporary, she needed answers, and Rebecca was the only person who could give them. "Rebecca, I know this is hard, but please try to think. Was there anyone John had trouble with? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt him?" Rebecca's eyes welled up with tears. She shook her head again, more forcefully this time. "No, he didn't have enemies. John was a kind man. Everyone liked him. He was always helping people. He loved his job, loved teaching history. He was a man of routine. He wouldn't have done anything to make anyone angry." Sarah looked at Rebecca with sympathy, but also with a growing sense of unease. It didn't make sense. John Holloway was beloved in the community, known for his kindness and generosity, but someone had killed him, someone with a purpose. "I'm going to need you to stay here while we investigate. Rebecca, you're not a suspect. I just need to ask you more questions as we go forward. Right now, we're focusing on finding who did this." Rebecca nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, as if she was trying to wipe away the horror that was now her reality. "Please find out who did this to him. I need to know why." Lily Holloway, a child's perspective. As Sarah continued to question Rebecca, Mark had gone to find Lily, John and Rebecca's 9-year-old daughter. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, talking to children about violence, especially when it involved their own family, was never simple. But Lily might have seen something, heard something, or noticed something that no one else did. Mark found Lily sitting at the dining table, her head resting on her arms as if she had fallen asleep but hadn't quite managed to drift off. Her innocent face was pale, and her eyes were wide with a mix of confusion and exhaustion. She looked like a child who had just witnessed something she couldn't possibly understand. "Lily," Mark asked gently, "Sweetheart, I know you're scared, but I need to ask you a few things. Can you tell me what happened tonight?" Lily lifted her head slowly, her gaze meeting Mark's with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She wiped her eyes, as though trying to shake off the lingering haze of shock. "I don't know," she said softly. "I was in my room. I was drawing, and then I heard some loud noises. It sounded like someone was shouting. But it wasn't loud like when Mom and Dad fight. It was different. I don't know." Mark nodded, his heart aching for the little girl. He had a daughter of his own, and he couldn't even begin to imagine the terror Lily must have felt, being so close to such a tragedy. Did you see anyone? Was there anyone at the door or near the window? Lily paused for a moment, her brows furrowing as she thought. I didn't see anyone outside, she said finally. But I heard footsteps, like someone was walking around outside, but I didn't think it was anything bad. I thought it was just Dad going to bed. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Lily's words were unsettling. Could someone have been watching the house before the attack? Was this murder planned? Or was it random? And if it was random, why would anyone target John Holloway? Thank you, Lily, Mark said softly, trying not to show his concern. You've been very helpful. Just stay here for a little while, okay? We'll take care of everything. The case takes a dark turn. As Sarah and Mark continued to gather their initial evidence and interview the Holloway family, the questions kept piling up. There was no clear motive. There were no obvious enemies. Yet, John Holloway had been brutally murdered, and the only clue left behind was a trail of blood and confusion. Back at the scene, Sarah meticulously combed through the living room, cataloging every piece of evidence. She took photographs of the blood spatter on the walls, the overturned coffee table, the broken lamp, and John's body. The details were horrifying. The deep wounds on John's body, the obvious signs of a struggle. This wasn't just a random killing. This was personal. As Sarah stepped outside for a moment of clarity, she noticed something else. The wind had picked up. The once clear sky now filled with dark, threatening clouds. There was a storm brewing. Not just in the weather, but in the Holloway family's life. Sarah took a deep breath and called in for forensic experts. She knew this case wasn't going to be easy, and it was only just beginning. But one thing was certain. The small town of Westfield would never be the same again. The investigative breakthrough. Days passed since the murder of John Holloway, and the investigation into the crime seemed to lead Sarah and Mark down countless dead ends. The neighbors had little to offer, the usual leads, a brief foray into John's work colleagues and a review of his financial history, revealed nothing that pointed to a motive, no debts, no hidden enemies, and certainly no clues that connected John to anyone who would want him dead. His life, it seemed, had been a simple one, until the night it ended in violence. Then came the breakthrough, something small yet telling that might just be the missing piece of the puzzle. It came in the form of a phone call. A local witness, a young man named David Myers, who worked the late shift at the corner store just a block from the Holloway residence, came forward. He claimed to have seen something unusual the evening of the murder. At first, David hesitated to speak, uncertain if his information mattered in the grand scheme of things. But as the story unfolded, Sarah realized it might be just what they needed. David had seen someone near the Holloway house, but not just anyone. He described a figure. A man, tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie and a baseball cap. Lingering near the corner of the street, he wasn't standing still. David described the figure as walking in and out of sight, like he was waiting for something or someone. What caught David's attention most, however, was the man's behavior. It wasn't the kind of casual waiting someone might do if they were waiting for a bus or talking on a phone. It was far more deliberate. A few minutes before the store closed, David saw the figure slip into the shadows, vanishing out of sight. At the time, David thought nothing of it. He didn't know that a brutal murder had just taken place only a few hundred feet away. But now, thinking back on it, the sight of that man seemed more important than ever. A mysterious stranger. Sarah and Mark made the decision to check out the location David had pointed out. Just a short walk from the Holloway home, the neighborhood, which once appeared so quiet, now felt like a place of lingering secrets. The corner store was a small, unassuming building, its once bustling aisles now empty, the late-night shelves in quiet disarray. As they walked the block, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Too many unanswered questions, too many things that didn't add up. If this man had been waiting near the Holloway house, why? Had he been watching the house for hours? Or had he been there just moments before the crime took place? Standing at the corner now, it became clear that someone had known the layout of the neighborhood well enough to blend in. This wasn't a random occurrence. The more Sarah thought about it, the more the stranger seemed like an integral part of the puzzle. Was he the one who'd been watching? Or had he been another player, someone simply at the wrong place at the wrong time? We need to get footage from every camera in this area, Sarah muttered, her hand resting on the corner pole. There's got to be something we can work with. We have to find this guy. After canvassing the nearby businesses, they got their first real lead. A grainy image from a security camera facing the alley behind the store. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start with. The man David had seen was now captured on tape, his face obscured, but there was something in his posture that was unmistakable. A sense of urgency, a predator on the move, the way he checked over his shoulder, the quick pace of his walk. It wasn't the calm of someone waiting for a friend or casually strolling. It was the deliberate motion of someone preparing to act. Was this man connected to the murder of John Holloway? Or had he merely been caught up in the wake of something far darker? A connection to the past. The days that followed were filled with grueling work, connecting the dots, checking alibis, questioning the Holloway family again. But despite all the evidence they had gathered, something about this case still felt off. As Sarah sat at her desk in the precinct one evening, poring over case files and notes, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to John Holloway's past. Something no one had known about. His past had been clean, his record spotless, but was it truly as simple as it seemed? She couldn't ignore the nagging thought that maybe they were looking at the case from the wrong angle. She decided to speak to Rebecca again, hoping that a second conversation might yield something new. Maybe she had missed something in her earlier questioning, perhaps, buried deep in the recesses of Rebecca's memory. There was something more that could unlock the mystery of her husband's death. When Sarah arrived at the Holloway house, she was greeted with a quiet tension that hung in the air. Rebecca, though still distraught, had agreed to sit down with Sarah once more. Sarah had a hunch, something she couldn't quite explain, but that told her there was more to John's story than anyone had realized. This wasn't just about a brutal murder. This was about something far older, something that had been brewing under the surface for years. Rebecca, Sarah began gently, taking a seat across from her. I need to ask you something important, and I want you to be honest with me. I know this is hard, but I need to know if there's anything at all, that you haven't told me about John. Was there ever a time he seemed different? Maybe distant? Rebecca's gaze flickered briefly, as if Sarah's words had struck something deep inside. She hesitated, her hands shaking as she pushed her hair behind her ears, the weight of the past pressing against her fragile composure. Sarah, I don't know how to explain this, Rebecca started, her voice faltering. John? He was always such a good man, always there for me, always there for Lily. But there were times, I swear, that I saw something in his eyes, a kind of distance. Like he wasn't really there, and sometimes when he came home late after a meeting or a drink with friends, he would have this faraway look in his eyes. I never questioned it. I told myself it was nothing. Rebecca's words left Sarah with more questions than answers. Could John have been hiding something? Could he have been involved in something dangerous that Rebecca never knew about? And if so, could it have led to his death? Rebecca continued, her voice quiet now, filled with the uncertainty of someone trying to piece together fragments of the past. There was one night, though, just a few weeks ago, John came home and he seemed shaken. He didn't talk about it. But when I asked him what was wrong, he told me nothing. He said everything was fine. But I saw it. I saw that fear in his eyes, and I knew he was hiding something. I just didn't push it. I thought he'd tell me when he was ready. Dark shadows of the past. As Sarah listened to Rebecca, the pieces began to form a darker picture. John Holloway wasn't just a teacher, a devoted husband, and a loving father. There was more to him, something buried beneath the surface, something that perhaps even Rebecca had been blind to. Could it have been the catalyst for his murder? After the conversation, Sarah spent the next few days looking into John's past, trying to uncover anything that could explain the strange behavior Rebecca had described. It wasn't easy. John had kept his life tightly controlled, with few outward connections to anything illicit or troubling. But then, through a quiet tip from an old colleague, Sarah found something. Something that made her blood run cold. A string of old debts, dating back to before his marriage. Several bank records showed an unusual transaction. large sums of money paid off over time with one name attached to them: Franklin Turner. The name rang a bell. Franklin Turner was a man Sarah had heard of before. An old associate of John Holloway's, someone who had been in trouble with the law years ago. Sarah had only briefly glanced at his file, but now, with the new information about the debts, she saw a connection she hadn't noticed before. Franklin Turner had once been involved in a criminal organization tied to organized theft and black market operations. Could John have been involved in something far darker than anyone realized? And if so, was Franklin Turner the key to unraveling the mystery? The enigmatic Franklin Turner. Sarah sat back in her chair, staring at the dossier that now sat before her. All of the old papers regarding Franklin Turner spread out before her like an intricate puzzle. Turner was a name that had been whispered in the darker corners of the criminal underworld, and his ties to John Holloway were more than just passing acquaintances. He was the kind of person that some might call a ghost. Someone who lived in the shadows, weaving in and out of trouble, but never fully coming into the light. And yet, his involvement in the case was becoming undeniable. The debts John had accrued over the years, paid off under Turner's name, pointed to something far more complex than a mere financial transaction. Sarah's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. Was it possible that John had been forced into some kind of financial arrangement with Franklin Turner? And if so, what had happened between them? What had led to a man like John, seemingly harmless, to become entangled in the dangerous web of organized crime? It wasn't long before Sarah felt that uncomfortable pit in her stomach again. This wasn't just a murder. This wasn't just some random act of violence. The threads of betrayal, power, and fear were beginning to emerge, and John Holloway had been at the center of it all. But the deeper Sarah dove into Turner's past, the more unsettling the connections became. Turner's name appeared in various criminal cases over the years, mostly related to illegal arms trading, money laundering, and a host of other shady dealings. There was no direct evidence of John Holloway's involvement in any of these crimes. But something told Sarah that the story didn't end with just the debts. The mysterious meeting. Weeks had passed since Sarah had first uncovered the connection between John Holloway and Franklin Turner. Her investigation had only deepened, and she felt like she was standing on the edge of something dark, something so murky and convoluted that it was hard to tell where it began or ended. The phone call she received that morning did nothing to ease the tension in her chest. A voice on the other end of the line sounded urgent. It was a tip-off from someone who had been watching the case from the shadows, someone who knew more than they should. The caller had been hesitant, even afraid, but in the end, they shared what they knew. Turner had been meeting with John just a few days before the murder. The meeting had been arranged in secret, held in an undisclosed location. The voice on the phone couldn't provide the details of the conversation, but the fact that they had met was a new lead. At the same time, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Sarah had been working with Mark on trying to identify any strange interactions John may have had prior to his death. There had been talk of a heated argument between John and someone with connections to Turner. She pulled up the old security footage from the nearby neighborhood, scouring it for anything that might connect to the days leading up to the murder. And there it was, John, a man in a long coat and a dark car, parked outside an alley behind a diner. The footage was grainy, but the silhouette of Franklin Turner was unmistakable. There was no question about it. John had met Turner just days before his death, and the timing of the meeting was far too suspicious to ignore. But what had happened between them? Why had John, a man seemingly so gentle and unassuming, felt the need to meet with someone like Turner? Was it out of fear, or was it greed? Sarah's gut told her there was something more, something that could change the entire trajectory of the investigation. A family torn apart. The news of Franklin Turner's involvement in the case came as a shock to Rebecca Holloway. Sarah had hesitated to share all of the details with her, but as the investigation progressed, it was becoming clear that Rebecca had to be told. The Holloway family, already reeling from John's murder, now had to contend with the horrifying realization that her husband had been involved in something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. When Sarah arrived at the Holloway home, the weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air. Rebecca had spent the past few weeks struggling to come to terms with her husband's death. But now, with the revelation of Franklin Turner's role, She was faced with the harsh reality that her husband had been keeping dark secrets. Rebecca sat across from Sarah, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. "How could this happen?" she asked, her voice trembling. "John, he was always so good to me, to Lily. He was a teacher, a father. How could he have gotten involved with someone like Franklin Turner?" Sarah took a deep breath, careful with her words. "Rebecca, sometimes people get caught up in things they never expect. They get in too deep, and it's harder to get out. I don't think John meant for this to happen. He was trying to protect his family." "But protect us from what?" Rebecca interrupted, her voice shaking with emotion. "What did he get us involved in? What did he bring into our lives?" The questions were flooding Rebecca's mind, and Sarah could sense her pain, her overwhelming need for answers. "I can't answer everything right now, but what I can tell you is that your husband had debts. Debts tied to Turner, and it seems like they had a relationship that went beyond what we initially thought. There was a meeting between them shortly before John was killed. What I don't know is why he felt the need to meet with Turner. There's a lot more to uncover." Rebecca's face paled. Do you think Turner had something to do with John's death?" Sarah looked at Rebecca, her heart heavy with the truth. "I don't know, but everything points to the idea that John's death wasn't random. It wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. There's a bigger story at play here, and we're just starting to unravel it." Rebecca was silent for a long moment, her face a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. "What now? What should I do?" "There's nothing you could have done, Rebecca. You couldn't have known what was happening behind the scenes. But what we need to focus on now is finding out what John was involved in, and how Turner fits into all of this. He's the key to unlocking this case, uncovering the truth." With the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together, Sarah and Mark focused on digging deeper into Franklin Turner's past. It wasn't long before they uncovered disturbing connections between Turner and several high-profile criminal cases. What started as a simple investigation into a murder had now escalated into a far more dangerous situation, one that threatened to implicate more than just John Holloway. Turner had long been a figure of interest for law enforcement. Though he had never been charged with anything directly, he was a middleman, a fixer, someone who helped criminals avoid the law, who facilitated transactions in the shadows. But what was his relationship with John? And how had their paths crossed? The breakthrough came when they managed to track down one of Turner's former associates, a man named Thomas Reed, who had once worked closely with Franklin in the past. Reed had since disappeared, but after a bit of searching, Sarah and Mark found a way to track him down. It wasn't easy, but they had a lead, and that was all they needed. Reed had been more than willing to talk. He spoke about Turner's connections, about the quiet dealings, the whispered conversations that always took place in the back of darkened rooms. But what shocked Sarah the most was Reed's revelation about John Holloway's involvement. "John was never just a teacher," Reed said, his voice low and cautious. "He was smart, real smart. He knew how to play the game. He got involved in some risky business with Turner, something that was supposed to stay under wraps, but people like Turner? They don't stay under the radar for long. It wasn't long before Turner had him hooked." Reed continued to spill information, painting a picture of John as someone who had slowly drifted into Turner's world, driven by some kind of pressure. Maybe financial, maybe personal, whatever the reason, it was enough to lead John into the orbit of someone dangerous, and now it was too late to undo the damage. As Sarah processed the new information, she realized that she wasn't just investigating a murder anymore. She was looking at a conspiracy, one that reached further than she had ever imagined, and Franklin Turner, it seemed, was just the tip of the iceberg. The hidden threats. The investigation had taken a dark turn. Sarah could feel it in the air. The mounting pressure to get to the truth, but also the sense of looming danger. The deeper she dug into the relationship between John Holloway and Franklin Turner, the more she realized that they weren't just dealing with a simple murder. This was something much more complex, something entrenched in the shadows of criminal networks that operated just beneath the surface of society. Sarah and Mark spent countless hours poring over every scrap of evidence they could find, trying to make sense of it all. The sudden, mysterious appearance of Franklin Turner on the radar was just the beginning. There were more players involved, some that Sarah could sense were even more dangerous than Turner. The question was, Who could they trust in a case where lies and manipulation were the currency of the players involved? Mark had been scouring through local connections, trying to track down anyone who might have seen something out of the ordinary in the weeks before John's murder. One name came up repeatedly in his research: Catherine Bellamy. She was a local bar owner and a woman with a reputation for being far more involved in the underworld than she let on. Catherine had a history of associating with known criminals, but she was smart. She kept herself clean, or so it seemed. Sarah and Mark knew they needed to find out what, if anything, Catherine knew about John and Turner. The dark corners of the city. Catherine's bar, the Hollow Oak, was a dimly lit, smoky haven tucked into a forgotten corner of the city. A place that many locals frequented. Though few were willing to admit it, it had a reputation, but no one ever said it out loud. People came to the Hollow Oak for a drink, but they also came to hear whispers, to exchange information, to make deals in the shadows. Sarah knew she would have to tread carefully. She and Mark stood outside the bar, looking at the neon sign flickering weakly in the twilight. There was something almost otherworldly about the place, like it didn't belong in the city, like it was part of another dimension where the law didn't exist. Sarah took a deep breath and steeled herself for whatever was about to unfold inside. The heavy door creaked open as they stepped in. The air was thick with the smell of beer and stale smoke. The low murmur of conversation filled the space, with only the occasional burst of laughter cutting through the tension. Catherine Bellamy was behind the bar, wiping down the counter, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto Sarah's. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice smooth and controlled. She wasn't fazed by their presence, but neither was she welcoming. Sarah walked up to the bar, trying to gauge Catherine's reaction. "We need to talk about someone," she began, keeping her tone neutral. "Someone who used to come around here, John Holloway." The name hung in the air, and for a moment, Catherine didn't respond. Her fingers froze on the rag, her eyes narrowing as if weighing the consequences of speaking too much. "I don't know him," Catherine said, her voice low but sharp. "You've got the wrong person." Sarah could tell the woman was lying. The coldness in her response was too rehearsed, too perfect. "You sure about that?" Mark pushed, his voice low but insistent. "You sure you haven't seen him around? Maybe with someone else?" Catherine hesitated, then slowly set the rag down, her gaze shifting to a man sitting in the corner booth. The man was watching them intently, a beer bottle in one hand. He looked like he could have been a regular. A tough guy, the kind of person who didn't take kindly to strangers. Catherine's expression softened slightly, but it didn't escape Sarah's notice that she was trying to steer the conversation away from the subject of John. "You should go," Catherine said, her voice suddenly harsh. "This isn't the place for your kind of questions." But Sarah wasn't going to back down. "I know you're involved with people who know Franklin Turner," she said, her words cutting through the tension. "And I think you know more about John Holloway than you're letting on. So, you can either tell me what you know, or I can make things very difficult for you." Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line, but after a long, drawn-out silence, she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine. You want to know about John? He came here a couple of times, but not like you think. He wasn't one of my regulars, but I saw him with Turner a few weeks ago. They had a quiet conversation in the back, nothing too out of the ordinary. But I overheard something, just a few words, but it stuck with me." "What did they say?" Sarah asked, leaning in. Catherine glanced around, making sure no one was listening before she spoke. "Turner said something about how John was in too deep, that he had no way out. I didn't hear much, but it was clear Turner was putting pressure on him. I didn't know it at the time, but now, I guess I do. That man, he's bad news. The ties that bind, the consequence of choices." Back at Sarah's office, the weight of what Catherine had said lingered heavily. "John was in too deep," she repeated to herself. That one sentence seemed to carry the entire case on its back. If John had been pressured by Franklin Turner, and if Turner had been manipulating him for some time, it made sense that John might have felt trapped. But why didn't he tell anyone? Was he protecting his family? Or was there something more sinister at play? And yet, even with this new information, there were still gaps. Sarah and Mark had managed to uncover some details about John's financial issues, but no one had been able to fully explain what exactly had led to his involvement with Turner. The more Sarah investigated, the more she realized that this wasn't just a financial problem. It was a life-and-death issue. Something John had underestimated until it was too late. The police had never fully grasped the extent of the situation. They believed it was simply a matter of a man being killed over a botched robbery, a crime of passion gone wrong. But Sarah knew better. She had uncovered too much to believe that simple explanation. John Holloway had been at the center of something far darker, something that would require every ounce of her determination to unravel. Sarah leaned back in her chair, reviewing the evidence they had so far. It was clear that Turner was the key to understanding everything. But Turner wasn't going to make it easy. The closer Sarah got to him, the more dangerous the game became. People had already been hurt, and it seemed like Turner wasn't afraid to leave a trail of bodies in his wake if it meant protecting his empire. Her mind raced with possibilities. There was no turning back now. It was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about taking down a criminal empire, one that had used manipulation, fear, and violence to keep everyone in line, and Sarah was determined to see it through no matter the cost. The final warning. Just as Sarah began to make progress, an unexpected phone call came in. Mark had tracked down some old associates of Turner's, but they were hesitant to talk. Every new piece of the puzzle seemed to bring more questions than answers. Sarah felt as though she was getting closer to the truth, but at the same time, she felt the danger closing in on her. This wasn't just a simple investigation, it was a race against time, and the longer she stayed on this path, the more she could sense that she was becoming a target. The people who operated in these shadows wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way, and Sarah was standing at the front of that line. Her phone buzzed again. Another text message from an anonymous source. A single line of text. "Stay away from Turner. He'll come for you next. A step ahead." As the investigation moved forward, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She couldn't pinpoint the source, but she felt it every time she left her office, every time she met someone new in the case, every time she reviewed the evidence. It was like there were eyes on her from the shadows, just waiting for her to slip up. The walls were closing in, and every new discovery brought her closer to the center of a web that was spinning faster than she could follow. Mark had managed to get a lead on one of Franklin Turner's associates, a man named Tommy Blanchard, who was allegedly involved in a number of shady business dealings in the city. The last time anyone had seen him was at the Hollow Oak Bar, the same place where Sarah had confronted Catherine Bellamy. It was becoming clear that Turner's operations stretched far and wide, and Tommy Blanchard was one of the key players who could unravel the entire network. But there was a problem. Tommy Blanchard was a ghost. No one knew where he lived. No one knew where he worked, and no one could confirm his whereabouts. As the investigation progressed, it became evident that he had disappeared, seemingly without a trace. Every lead they chased turned cold. Every door they knocked on led to a dead end. It was as if Blanchard had simply vanished off the face of the earth. Sarah's gut told her that Blanchard was hiding somewhere in plain sight, blending in with the rest of the city. The web Turner had woven wasn't just criminal. It was smart, it was cunning, and it was built on years of manipulation. Turner knew how to stay out of the limelight, how to stay under the radar while pulling strings behind the scenes. The more Sarah dug, the more she realized how deeply the city had become entangled in this web of corruption. A ghost in the machine. With no new leads on Blanchard, Sarah decided to turn her attention back to Franklin Turner. The man was slippery, elusive, and his charm was as dangerous as his criminal empire. He had a way of making people feel like they were in his debt, and Sarah knew that anyone who owed Turner a favor might be willing to do anything to protect him. But Sarah was no stranger to manipulation. She understood the power of secrets, of lies, of control. Mark was now reaching out to informants within Turner's circle, trying to get someone, anyone, to talk. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear that Turner was a man of layers. On the surface, he was the charming businessman, the well-dressed investor who made everyone feel important. But beneath that facade was a ruthless, cold-hearted criminal who had no problem destroying anyone who stood in his way. It was clear that Turner was protecting something so valuable that he was willing to risk everything to keep it safe. Sarah wasn't sure what it was yet, but she was determined to find out. One day, As Sarah reviewed the financial records they had subpoenaed, she stumbled upon a series of irregularities. Shell companies, fake transactions, and accounts that didn't add up at first. It seemed like just another piece of the puzzle, but as she dug deeper, it became evident that these accounts were tied to some of the most dangerous people in the city. Turner had connections with international crime syndicates, arms dealers, and drug cartels. His web of influence reached far beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. The more she connected the dots, the clearer it became that John Holloway hadn't just been a victim of a random act of violence. He had been a pawn in a larger game. A game that Sarah was now caught in the middle of. The stakes were higher than she had ever anticipated, and the danger was more real than ever. The first threat. As Sarah sat in her office late one evening, going over the new information they had uncovered, she heard a soft knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she looked up, she saw Mark standing there, his face pale and drawn. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, feeling a knot form in her stomach. Mark didn't look like himself. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something that resembled fear. "They know," Mark whispered, glancing around nervously. "They know we're on to them." "What are you talking about?" Sarah's heart raced. She stood up from her desk, her mind already racing through all the possibilities. "I've been getting calls. Anonymous calls," Mark continued, his voice shaky. "Threatening calls. They've been warning me to back off, to leave this case alone. But it's not just that. When I went home tonight, I found something in my mailbox." Mark reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. It was unmarked, with no return address, just a single word written on the front. "Back OFF." Sarah took the envelope from him, feeling the weight of the situation settle over her like a cold blanket. She opened it carefully, pulling out a piece of paper. Inside, there was only one sentence written in bold, red letters. "If you don't stop, you'll be next." For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, staring at the words. She knew the message was real. Whoever was behind this, whoever was protecting Turner, wasn't just playing games, they were sending a warning, and it was one they couldn't ignore. "We can't back off," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. "We're too close. We have to keep going." Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with doubt. "What if they hurt someone? What if—" "No," Sarah interrupted. "We don't stop, not now. We can't let them win. We've come too far." Mark nodded slowly, though it was clear he wasn't entirely convinced. "What's the next step, then?" Sarah took a deep breath, her mind already racing with the next move. "We need to find out what Turner is really hiding. If he's involved with international syndicates, there's something bigger here. Something that could bring him down for good. But we need to be careful. We're walking on dangerous ground now. We need to figure out how to expose him without getting ourselves killed in the process." The final piece. Despite the threat, Sarah pressed on. The next few days were a blur of investigation, digging through Turner's past, questioning more informants, and following the trail wherever it led. It wasn't until a conversation with an old colleague at the police department that Sarah received the final piece of the puzzle. Her colleague, Detective Angela Wells, had been doing some research into Turner's past, and she stumbled across something that sent chills down her spine. Turner's empire wasn't just built on illegal businesses and dirty deals. It was built on something more sinister. Turner had been involved in a human trafficking ring for years, using his wealth and influence to hide the truth. He had been orchestrating the movement of young women across state lines, and even internationally under the guise of legitimate business deals. Sarah couldn't believe it. This was it, the final thread that connected everything. If Turner was involved in trafficking, then John Holloway's murder had a far deeper purpose. John had been trying to expose Turner's trafficking ring, and that's why he was silenced. His death wasn't a random act. It was a calculated move to protect a far larger criminal operation. With this new information, Sarah felt both empowered and terrified. She knew now that there was no turning back. The investigation had reached a point of no return. The web was tightening, and the clock was ticking. But as Sarah prepared to confront Turner with the truth, she couldn't shake the feeling that the biggest danger wasn't Turner himself. It was the people who were watching her every move, waiting for the moment to strike. The midnight meeting. The night had fallen heavy and dark, as if the world was holding its breath. Sarah sat in her office, the dim light from her desk lamp casting shadows across the room. The weight of the investigation had begun to wear on her, every day bringing new pieces of a puzzle that didn't seem to fit. The phone call from Detective Angela Wells earlier had been a turning point. Sarah now knew the full scope of Turner's crimes. The human trafficking ring was just the tip of the iceberg. It seemed that every time Sarah peeled back a layer, a deeper, more sinister truth emerged. Mark had been on edge ever since the threats began. But tonight, something had changed in him. His usual composure was cracked, replaced by a sense of urgency that matched her own. He called her earlier that evening, telling her to meet him at the downtown diner. There was something he needed to show her, something that could finally take down Turner for good. As Sarah made her way through the empty streets, her mind raced. Every step felt like a countdown, each second bringing her closer to either the breakthrough she desperately needed or the danger that seemed to lurk around every corner. She arrived at the diner just past midnight, its neon sign flickering dimly in the dark. Mark was already sitting in a booth at the far end, his back to the door. Sarah slid into the seat across from him, and without a word, Mark pushed a folder across the table. Her eyes scanned the contents, and her heart sank. Inside, there were photographs, high-resolution images of a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Taken from a hidden vantage point, the photos depicted several men and women, bound and blindfolded, being loaded into unmarked vans. The warehouse was situated in an industrial area, a place Sarah had passed many times without giving it a second thought. But these images told a different story. They told her that Turner's operation wasn't just a network of businesses. It was a sprawling, organized human trafficking operation that stretched far beyond anything she had imagined. Mark looked at her, his eyes full of determination. "I've been tracking these shipments for weeks. They come and go like clockwork. Turner's people are well-connected, Sarah. And it's not just the local ring. It's international. This is bigger than we thought." Sarah looked up, her pulse quickening. "How did you get these?" "I've been working with some sources," Mark replied, his voice low. "They've been feeding me information, but it's risky. We can't trust everyone. Turner has eyes everywhere." Sarah nodded, her mind already working. The photographs were the proof she needed, the tangible evidence that could bring Turner's entire empire to its knees. But it wasn't enough. She needed to get inside the operation, to expose the people involved and ensure that Turner would be held accountable. She had to act fast. But as they sat in the diner, plotting their next move, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, heart racing. The message was from Angela Wells. "We've got a problem. They know. Turner's people just hit our informant. Be careful, trust no one. The reckoning begins." The weight of Angela's message hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She didn't need to ask what hit meant. She knew. Turner's people weren't just making threats anymore. They were acting. The informant, who had been feeding them crucial intel, was now in danger. The clock was ticking faster than ever before. "Mark," Sarah said, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to move now." Mark nodded, the usual calm in his eyes replaced by a flicker of fear. "What do we do?" "We need to get to that warehouse," Sarah replied. "This is our chance. We can't let Turner escape now. We've got the proof. But we need to get the rest of the operation. We can't wait for them to come for us." Mark agreed without hesitation, and together, they left the diner, heading straight for the industrial district where the warehouse was located. Every turn felt like it was taking them closer to danger. But Sarah couldn't let fear cloud her judgment. Turner had built an empire on terror, but they had the truth on their side. They arrived at the warehouse just before dawn, the world still shrouded in darkness. Sarah's mind was spinning. How did Turner know they were coming? Had someone tipped him off? Had their investigation been compromised? As they approached the entrance, they heard the sound of voices in the distance. Low murmurs, but enough to make Sarah's heart race. She motioned for Mark to stay behind the cover of a nearby container. and they watched as several men unloaded crates from a van. The men were armed, and their movements were precise, coordinated. This wasn't the work of a small-time operation. Turner's organization was well-structured, and every move they made was calculated. "We need to get inside," Sarah whispered, her mind working rapidly to come up with a plan. "We'll have to make our way through the back. Keep your head down and stay low." They moved cautiously, staying out of sight as they crept around the back of the warehouse. The massive steel doors loomed ahead of them, locked and fortified. But Sarah had anticipated this. She had a plan. She'd brought the tools necessary to break in, and now, as she looked at the lock, she felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. But just as Sarah reached for the tools in her bag, a sound froze her in place. A metallic click followed by the soft hum of a vehicle engine starting. The van that had been unloading earlier was now reversing, and the men were loading something or someone into the back. The thought hit Sarah like a wave of nausea. They were moving the captives. Now was their last chance to stop it. "We can't let them leave," Sarah muttered, her voice tight with urgency. Mark hesitated, his face etched with concern. "But what if it's a trap?" Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she pushed the tools into his hands. "You cover the entrance. I'll handle this." Without waiting for a response, Sarah darted toward the back of the warehouse, her heart pounding in her chest. The adrenaline surged through her veins, drowning out everything but the mission at hand. She was so close now. They had everything they needed. This was the final step. The warehouse door was heavy, and the lock was stubborn. But Sarah was determined. She had no time to waste. She twisted the lock, and with a final, desperate push, the door gave way. She slipped inside, the darkness surrounding her like a heavy fog. But she didn't stop. She moved quickly, silently, through the shadows, careful not to alert anyone. The hum of the engine grew louder, and the unmistakable sound of muffled cries reached her ears. She found them, captive women, their faces pale and terrified, shackled to the walls of a cold, concrete room. The sight of them, so broken and helpless, struck Sarah deeply. But there was no time to dwell on the horror. She had to act fast. With a surge of determination, she rushed to the women, whispering to them as she fumbled with the chains that held them in place. "I'm here to help," she said. "You're going to be okay. We're getting you out." As Sarah worked quickly, her thoughts raced. How many others were out there? How many more lives had been torn apart by Turner's greed? The weight of the truth hit her like a flood, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not now. The unexpected twist. Just as Sarah freed the last woman from her chains, a noise behind her froze her in place. She spun around to find a man standing in the doorway. His face was familiar. One of Turner's men, the same person she had seen in the photographs earlier. He grinned at her, an expression that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You're too late," he said. "You think you can stop this? Turner always has a backup plan." Before Sarah could react, the man lunged forward, pulling out a gun. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment she had feared, the moment the entire investigation could come crashing down. But just as the man raised the gun, Mark appeared in the doorway, a firearm in his hand. Without a word, he shot. The bullet finding its mark, the man crumpled to the ground with a sickening thud. "Go," Mark urged, his voice steady. "I'll cover you." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed the women, urging them to run. As they dashed toward the exit, the sounds of chaos erupted behind them. Shouts, gunshots, the unmistakable sound of Turner's operation crumbling beneath them. Sarah knew they weren't out of danger yet, but they were so close. Turner's empire was falling apart, and she had the proof. As they reached the street, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange. The night had been long, but Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. Turner's network was far-reaching, and the battle wasn't over. But they had taken the first step toward exposing the truth. The shattered trust. The hours that followed their narrow escape from the warehouse felt like a blur. Sarah and Mark, along with the freed women, had been ushered to a safe house, a temporary refuge arranged by one of Mark's informants. But even as Sarah tried to steady her breathing and make sense of the chaos, her mind was in overdrive. Turner's empire was vast, and each decision they made had to be calculated. If they failed now, it would mean more lives lost, more suffering. The women they rescued were safe for the moment, but they needed to be debriefed, moved to a more secure location, and protected from retaliation. Turner's people would stop at nothing to erase their tracks, and Sarah knew that time was running out. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was pulling the strings behind the scenes, someone who had been watching their every move. Had their investigation been compromised? Was Turner truly the mastermind, or was he just another player in a much larger game? There were too many unanswered questions, too many layers yet to be uncovered. Mark sat across from her, his face drawn, his eyes tired. His expression had hardened over the last few hours, his stoic demeanor a mask hiding the growing storm inside him. "I don't like this, Sarah," Mark said, breaking the silence. "They knew we were coming. This wasn't just a random warehouse. Someone tipped them off." Sarah looked at him, her brows furrowed. "You think we've been compromised?" "I don't know," Mark admitted. "But something's off. I've been doing this a long time, and this whole situation feels too clean. Someone's been feeding Turner information, and it's been going on for longer than we've realized." Sarah leaned back, her eyes staring into the dimly lit room, her thoughts racing. She had to trust her instincts. They'd come this far. She couldn't afford to stop now, but the creeping sense of betrayal was a weight she couldn't ignore. Had they been walking into a trap the entire time? Betrayal at the heart. It was well into the night when Sarah received an unexpected call. The phone buzzed in her pocket, the screen flashing an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Sarah, it's Angela," came the voice on the other end. The sound of urgency was unmistakable. "I don't know how to say this, but we've got a mole." Her stomach churned. Angela had been the rock throughout the investigation, the one person Sarah had trusted completely. If Angela was saying there was a mole, it meant everything they had worked for could be undone in an instant. "Who?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who's working against us? I don't have all the details yet, but it's someone close to us," Angela continued. "I'm at the station now, you need to come in, Sarah. This is bigger than we thought." The line went dead before Sarah could respond, the weight of Angela's words hanging heavily in the air. The betrayal wasn't just external. It was internal, too. Sarah's mind raced. Who could it be? Who had they trusted so fully, only for them to stab them in the back? Mark looked up as Sarah ended the call, his eyes full of questions. "It's Angela," Sarah said quietly, her heart sinking. "She says we've been compromised. There's a mole." "Who?" Mark's voice was tense, a mixture of disbelief and anger. "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "But we need to get to the station fast." As they made their way to the police station, Sarah's thoughts churned. Who could they trust? It seemed that every step forward led them into deeper waters, and no matter how hard they fought, the tide was pulling them under. Confrontation in the dark. The police station was eerily quiet when Sarah and Mark arrived. It was almost as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Angela was waiting for them in the interrogation room, her expression tight, her eyes shadowed by the stress of the situation. "Sit down," Angela motioned to the chairs across from her. "We need to talk." Sarah and Mark sat, their bodies tense, the silence between them thick with anticipation. Angela took a moment before she spoke, her words heavy with regret. "I don't know how it happened," Angela said, her voice breaking. "But I think we've been set up from the beginning." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean?" "There's someone in the department who's been feeding Turner information. They knew about your investigation before we even started. All the leads we've been chasing, the evidence we've collected. Everything was a setup. I think they've been manipulating us this whole time." The revelation hit Sarah like a freight train. She had trusted everyone in this room, had relied on them to expose the truth, How could someone in their own department betray them like this? I don't know who it is, Angela continued, but I have my suspicions. We've been investigating Turner's network for months, but someone's been working against us from the inside, feeding him everything we've learned. Mark leaned forward, his fists clenched. Who? Angela hesitated, her eyes darting between Sarah and Mark. It's not just one person. There's a whole network, a string of individuals working with Turner. They've infiltrated every level of the investigation, and we've been blind to it. Sarah could barely process the words, her mind was spinning. It felt like every single thing they had worked for had been torn apart in an instant. If Turner's people had infiltrated the police force, they could be anywhere. There was no safety, no protection. How do we stop them? Mark asked, his voice steady but edged with anger. I don't know, Angela admitted. But we need to act fast. Whoever is behind this is getting close to finding out everything. We can't wait any longer. We need to expose them, or this whole thing is going to fall apart. Sarah could feel her stomach twist. This wasn't just about taking down Turner anymore. This was about survival. They were playing a game where the stakes were far higher than they had ever imagined. The final betrayal. As Sarah, Mark, and Angela made plans to confront the mole within the department, Sarah's phone buzzed once more, the sudden vibration breaking the tension in the room. She glanced at the screen, and her heart skipped a beat. It was a text message from an unknown number. You've been played. Turner knows everything. You'll never make it out alive. The words hit her like a slap to the face. Sarah had suspected that Turner had eyes everywhere. But this was different, this was personal. Whoever had sent this message was in the game now, and they weren't just threatening her, they were promising her downfall. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She looked at Mark and Angela, who were both watching her intently, waiting for her to say something. But the words stuck in her throat. There was no easy way to explain this. They were running out of time. They had to act. We're being watched, Sarah said quietly. Someone's one step ahead of us. Turner knows everything. Angela's face went pale, and Mark's jaw tightened. How do you know that? He asked, his voice low. That message, Sarah replied, holding up her phone. Whoever sent this knows exactly what we're planning. Mark stood up, pacing back and forth. We're being played, that much is clear. But we can't back down now, we can't let Turner win. Sarah knew he was right. They couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close. But she also knew the risk. Turner wasn't just a man anymore. He was a shadow, a ghost that had infiltrated every corner of their lives. And now, they were playing for their lives as much as they were playing for justice. With a deep breath, Sarah stood up. We go after the mole. Tonight. No more waiting. The last step. With renewed resolve, Sarah, Mark, and Angela left the interrogation room. Their minds focused on the final push. Turner had to be stopped. The mole had to be exposed. But they knew that every step they took from here on out could be their last. It was a race against time. And in the shadows of the city, Sarah knew the final confrontation was just beginning. Would they survive? Would they expose Turner and those who had helped him? Only time would tell. A night of reckoning. As the hours stretched late into the night, Sarah's thoughts grew heavier. The tension in the air was thick, oppressive, as if the very walls of the police station were closing in around them. Mark and Angela were both in silent agreement that they had no more time to waste. Every second spent hesitating was another second for Turner to tighten his grip on the investigation and continue his reign of terror undisturbed. Angela, Sarah said, breaking the silence, her voice low and filled with a grim determination. Who do you think it is? Who's behind this? Angela hesitated for a moment, her fingers tapping restlessly on the edge of the table. I don't know, it could be anyone, someone within the department who's been feeding Turner information. Someone with access, someone who knows exactly how we operate, but we've got to find out who, and we've got to do it fast. Sarah nodded slowly, her mind churning with possibilities. Who could it be? Who had they trusted, worked alongside, only to discover that their loyalty was to Turner, not to the cause of justice? She couldn't shake the growing feeling that they were being watched. She had always been cautious, always a few steps ahead of their enemies. But this time, It felt like the walls were closing in on her. Every decision she made seemed to have already been anticipated. Every lead she chased seemed to be a trap laid carefully in advance. Turner had outmaneuvered them at every turn. "Look," Mark said, his voice breaking into Sarah's thoughts. "We know one thing for sure. Someone tipped off Turner about the warehouse. They knew we were coming. They were waiting for us. We've got a rat in our midst, and we need to find out who it is before we lose everything." Angela stood up abruptly, pacing across the room, clearly agitated. "I've been going over everything, Sarah. Every detail. There's a pattern, a trail of breadcrumbs that leads us back here. The mole has been embedded within the force for years, I think. But who?" The realization hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning. The answer was right in front of her. What if it's someone from the inside? Someone who's been loyal to Turner from the beginning? What if we've been looking at this all wrong? Mark's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm saying that the mole isn't just someone who's feeding information. What if they've been working with Turner all along? What if they're part of his organization, embedded here to make sure no one can get too close?" Angela stopped pacing and turned to look at Sarah. "You think the mole's someone high up? Someone who could have access to all the details? Someone we would never suspect?" "That's exactly what I think," Sarah replied. "It's not just about being in the right place at the right time anymore. This mole knows how to cover their tracks. They've been careful, too careful. The plot unfolds. They knew they couldn't go on guessing, they had to act. The information Angela had given them, the suspicion that one of their own was sabotaging the investigation, was more than just a hunch now. It was a certainty. Every lead they'd followed, every step they'd taken, had somehow been monitored. Turner's network was vast, and it was becoming clear that they had underestimated just how deeply it had infiltrated the very department tasked with taking him down. "We need to narrow it down," Sarah said, her voice filled with urgency. "We need to figure out who had the most access, who could have gotten close enough to us without raising suspicion." Mark began rifling through a stack of files on the table, his mind already at work. "Let's start with who's been in and out of the operation. Who's been in contact with us directly? Who's been handling the sensitive intel?" Angela and Sarah looked over the list of names. Each person was a piece of the puzzle, but none of them stood out immediately. Every lead seemed to circle back on itself, creating an impenetrable web of doubt. "We've been chasing shadows," Angela muttered under her breath. "Everything we thought was a breakthrough has turned out to be another dead end." Sarah slammed her fist on the table, frustration boiling over. "We can't let this go on any longer. If we don't get the truth now, if we don't uncover the mole, we'll lose everything we've worked for. We'll be fighting a war we can't win." Mark turned to Sarah, his expression serious. "We'll find them. We'll tear through every file, every lead, until we get answers." But deep down, Sarah knew that time was running out. The mole was still out there, and whoever it was, they had the advantage. Every move they made was under constant surveillance. They were operating in the dark, and Turner had all the lights. The first step toward the truth. It was decided. They would need to go through the personnel records. Every officer involved in the investigation had to be re-examined. Sarah, Mark, and Angela sat side by side, poring over the files of every officer in the department who had access to the investigation's most sensitive information. They were determined to find the leak, but each file revealed little. Nothing that made any one officer stand out, but there was a constant feeling in Sarah's gut, a nagging sensation that something was just out of reach. Then they came across a name that stopped Sarah cold. Lieutenant Frank Mercer. At first glance, Mercer's name wasn't anything special. He had a long history with the department, and his work had always been highly regarded. But there was something about his presence that made Sarah's skin crawl. She had always trusted him, admired his professional demeanor and work ethic. But now, seeing his name among the files, she felt an unease she couldn't ignore. Something about his involvement in this investigation didn't add up. "Mercer," Mark said, his voice low. "He's been involved in this case from the start. He was the one who recommended us to follow that lead at the warehouse." Angela frowned. "You think it's him?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, her mind racing. "But it's a possibility. He's been too involved, Too close, we need to look deeper. Mark nodded. His jaw set. All right, we start with Mercer. The first confrontation. With no time to waste, Sarah and Mark decided to confront Lieutenant Mercer directly. They knew the risk involved in approaching a potential mole, especially someone as high-ranking as Mercer, but they had no choice. They couldn't let the mole's shadow stretch any longer over their investigation. It was late in the evening when they arrived at Mercer's office. The building was almost empty, save for a few officers finishing up their shifts. The air was thick with tension, as if everyone inside was aware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Mercer was sitting behind his desk, his face impassive as always. He looked up as Sarah and Mark entered, his expression unreadable. "Detectives," Mercer said, his voice calm. "What can I do for you?" Sarah wasted no time. "We need to talk, Mercer. There's been something off about this investigation. We've been going over the files, and your name keeps coming up." Mercer's eyes flickered for just a moment, but it was enough. Sarah saw it. An unmistakable flicker of something she couldn't quite place. "What's this about?" Mercer asked, his tone suddenly sharp. "You've been involved from the beginning, but we've found discrepancies," Sarah said, watching his every movement. "Your involvement in the warehouse lead, your access to sensitive information, it doesn't add up." Mercer's face remained stoic, but Sarah could see the shift in his posture. He wasn't as confident now. Something had changed. "I've done nothing wrong. I've been following orders. If there's a problem, it's on you, not me." Mark stepped forward, his voice low. "We know you've been feeding information to Turner, Mercer. This whole thing's been a setup from the start. You've been working with him." Mercer's eyes widened just slightly, but his hands remained steady on the desk. His lips curled into a tight smile. "You've got no proof of that. You're barking up the wrong tree." Sarah leaned in, her voice cold. "We'll find the proof, Mercer, we always do. A revelation that changes everything." The confrontation with Mercer didn't go as expected. He denied everything, his calm demeanor never wavering. But something in Sarah's gut told her that they were on the right track. He was too defensive, too quick to cover up the cracks in his story. As they left his office, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had just uncovered the first piece of a much larger puzzle. Mercer was hiding something, and with every step they took, they were getting closer to exposing the truth. But would they find the smoking gun before Mercer or Turner could destroy everything they had worked for? The quiet buzz of the fluorescent lights above them filled the room as Sarah sat back in the worn office chair. The glow from the screen illuminated her face, casting deep shadows across her tired eyes. Mark stood by the window, his back to her, hands resting on the sill as he gazed out into the empty streets below. The city had quieted down after the storm, but Sarah knew that beneath the calm, something far darker was brewing. "He's too meticulous," Sarah muttered under her breath, her fingers hovering over the keyboard but not typing. She scrolled through the pages of evidence again, trying to find the one detail that could finally break the case wide open. Every file, every piece of information seemed to circle back on itself, leading to dead ends, and all the while, Tyner remained one step ahead, his shadow lurking behind every clue. Mark turned to face her, his expression serious. "We've been doing this for weeks, Sarah. He's playing us, we know that. But the question is why? What's his endgame?" Sarah leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk, a sense of frustration settling deep in her chest. "I don't know. I keep thinking we've missed something. Some vital clue, but every time I think we're close, he covers his tracks." Her voice trailed off, frustration giving way to a gnawing sense of helplessness. Mark walked over and sat across from her, the chair creaking under his weight. His eyes narrowed as he thought, "There's something we're not seeing. Look, Tyner's methodical, he doesn't slip up. If we're going to catch him, we have to think like him. Every move he makes has a purpose." Sarah nodded. She could feel the pressure mounting. They couldn't afford to miss another opportunity. But the problem was that Tyner wasn't making mistakes. Every piece of evidence they had seemed carefully planted, leading them in circles. Every trail they followed had been either erased or expertly redirected. Whoever he was, Tyner was a ghost in the system, and they were mere mortals trying to track his every step. "We need to bait him," Mark finally said, breaking the silence. "But we need to do it without him realizing it's a trap." Sarah's gaze shifted from the screen to meet Mark's eyes, and she saw the determination there. "You mean make him come to us?" she asked, her voice full of skepticism. The idea was dangerous. They couldn't afford to rush into a confrontation, not without understanding exactly what they were dealing with. Tyner had a dangerous mind, one that would anticipate their every move. "We can't let him keep controlling the narrative," Mark said firmly. "He's making us play by his rules, but what if we flipped the game? What if we gave him just enough to make him feel like he's in control, just to lure him into a false sense of security?" Sarah paused. That was a risky strategy, a very risky one, but she couldn't deny that it might work, if they could deceive Tyner into thinking they had missed something crucial. It might force him to reveal himself. She exhaled slowly, her fingers moving over the keyboard as she formulated a plan in her mind. "If we're going to do this, we need to be careful. We need to make it look like we've given up, that we're out of leads. We need to fake defeat and make him think we're off his trail. Then we draw him out when he least expects it." Mark nodded. "Exactly, we use the silence to our advantage. We stop digging for a while. Stop looking for the answers. It'll make him think we're no longer a threat. Then, when he thinks he's safe, we strike." "But how do we make him believe we've given up?" Sarah asked, skeptical but intrigued. "We can't just pretend we're clueless. He'll see through that." Mark stood up and paced the room, thinking aloud. "What if we put out false information? Something big, something enticing? Maybe we make it look like we've found something new, some critical piece of evidence, and then let him think we've cracked the case. We don't follow up, we just let him think we've cornered him." "That could work," Sarah said slowly, her mind starting to race through the possibilities. "We plant the seed and let him water it, but we need the perfect piece of bait, something that looks real, that will make him act." Mark's eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. "The tape, we can use the tape we've got. We make it look like it's a recorded confession, something we know Tyner would want to destroy, a video that could implicate him directly in one of his crimes." "But the tape's not real," Sarah pointed out. Mark gave her a crooked smile. "That's why we don't actually release it. We just make him think we have it. We make it look like we've cracked the final piece of the puzzle, then sit back and wait for him to make the first move." The idea was dangerous. If they miscalculated, it could end disastrously. But it was their best chance. Tyner had been manipulating them for far too long. It was time for them to turn the tables. "We'll need to be careful about how we go about this," Sarah cautioned, her mind already working through the potential fallout. "We can't afford any mistakes. If Tyner realizes it's a trap, he'll disappear, and we may never find him again." Mark's jaw tightened as he stared out the window, deep in thought. "We'll do it on our terms. No more waiting for him to make the next move. This ends now." As Sarah gathered the materials to begin their plan, the realization began to set in. They were about to play a game of cat and mouse. But this time, the stakes were higher. The city around them, once bustling and alive, now felt eerily silent. Tyner was watching them. They both knew that, but now they had something he wanted, something that would finally pull him into the open. "I'll handle the press," Sarah said, determination lining her voice. "I'll start making the calls, plant the rumors, and feed them just enough to make Tyner think we've broken through. We'll make sure it looks convincing." Mark looked at her, his eyes hard. "And I'll set the trap. We need everything to fall into place perfectly." They worked quickly, coordinating their next steps with precision. They knew they didn't have much time. The false information would need to spread quickly, before Tyner could get wind of it and disappear again. As the plan began to take shape, Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline flood her veins. This was it. No more waiting, no more running around in circles. Tyner was about to make his move, and when he did, they'd be ready. The days that followed felt like a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. The plan was set in motion, and now Sarah and Mark could only wait and watch as the city buzzed with the planted rumors, the engineered whispers that would soon reach the ears of the elusive Tyner. It felt almost surreal, like they were playing a game they had no control over. Except this time, the rules were shifting in their favor. The press conference Sarah had arranged was scheduled for late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. The news outlets were quick to gather, sensing the growing excitement. There was a sense of urgency in the air, the kind that follows the revelation of a major lead. Sarah stood at the podium, her face calm but her heart pounding in her chest. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, each scenario unfolding with terrifying clarity. Now, the time had come to execute the plan. "We have new evidence," Sarah began, her voice firm, almost too confident. She glanced briefly at Mark in the back of the room before continuing. "A recently discovered video implicates a suspect in a series of high-profile crimes. This footage clearly shows the individual making a confession about the murders we've been investigating." She paused for effect, knowing her next words would send a shockwave through the gathered reporters. "While we're unable to release the video at this time, we can confirm that it is a key piece of evidence." The room fell into a hushed silence, reporters murmuring amongst themselves, trying to process what they had just heard. Sarah kept her expression neutral, every inch of her demeanor composed. Behind the scenes, Mark had already initiated the next part of the plan, working his network to ensure that the footage Sarah referred to, completely fabricated, was leaked to the right people. "We have every reason to believe that this video will be the breakthrough we've been waiting for," Sarah continued, leaning into the tension she had created. "We're working tirelessly to connect the dots, and this new evidence will be crucial in tracking down the suspect. But at this stage, we ask for the public's help. If anyone has seen anything unusual in the past week, please come forward." The press swarmed her with questions, but Sarah expertly deflected, staying calm, only reinforcing the idea that they had a breakthrough and that it was just a matter of time before they closed in on Tyner. As the press conference ended, she felt a surge of triumph. The ball was rolling. Now all they had to do was wait for the storm to begin. Back at the office, Sarah and Mark sat in front of their computers, watching as the fake story quickly gained traction. News outlets began to report on the new lead from the police, and social media exploded with speculation. Everyone was talking about the mysterious video, the video that could break the case wide open. The message was clear. Tyner was cornered. But Sarah knew better than anyone that this was just the beginning. It would take more than a planted rumor to bring down someone as meticulous as Tyner. He wasn't going to fall for a half-hearted trap. He was smart, ruthless, and utterly calculating. She had to believe, though, that this would work. It had to. The hours passed, and the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She checked the news again. Nothing new. Then again, still no change, no sign that Tyner had taken the bait. It was a frustrating silence, one that gnawed at her as she sat at her desk, her fingers drumming absently against the wood. Mark, sensing her unease, walked over and sat down beside her. "It's working," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "He's watching, we've got him." "I hope so," Sarah replied, her mind racing with possibilities. "But what if we're wrong? What if he's already moving?" "You're not giving him enough credit," Mark said with a slight smile. "We've pushed him into a corner. He's probably already plotting his next move, and when he does, we'll be ready." That's when it happened. The phone rang. The sudden noise sliced through the quiet office like a knife. Sarah jumped, her hand instinctively reaching for the receiver. She held it to her ear, her breath catching in her throat. "Detective Shaw," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sarah, it's me." A voice crackled on the other end. It was Detective Jacobs, a colleague they had been working closely with. "We've got something." Her pulse quickened. "What is it?" "We've been tracking Tyner's known contacts," Jacobs continued, "and we think we've found a lead. A warehouse near the docks. It's a long shot, but there's something suspicious about the place, and we've been able to trace a series of unmarked trucks that have been going in and out. Something's up." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This could be the break they needed. "Do we have eyes on the location?" she asked, already standing and reaching for her jacket. "We're setting up surveillance now," Jacobs said. "We could have eyes on the ground in a few hours. We just need your go-ahead to move forward." Sarah turned to Mark, who had already risen from his seat, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Let's move," Sarah said, her voice full of conviction. "We're going to hit him hard. This is our chance." The next few hours were a blur of preparation and tension. Sarah, Mark, and the rest of the team gathered their gear, reviewing their strategy over and over again. The warehouse near the docks was a prime location for Tyner to hide his operations, and they couldn't afford to make a mistake. Every detail had to be perfect. As night fell, the team moved out, driving in stealth mode to the warehouse district. The city had a different feel at night. The streets empty, the distant hum of traffic barely audible. The lights from the passing cars painted long shadows across the deserted roads, casting an eerie glow over everything. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette barely visible against the starless sky. Sarah's nerves were on edge. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. This could be their chance to finally catch Tyner. But it could also be a trap. Every part of her screamed to be cautious, to watch every corner, every movement. The last thing they needed was for him to slip away again. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked, his voice tight as he checked his gear. "Yeah," Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. "We've come this far. We're not turning back now." They parked a few blocks away and crept toward the warehouse on foot, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. Their hearts pounded in their chests, but they pushed forward, their steps careful and calculated. The closer they got, the more palpable the tension became. They were in enemy territory now, and Tyner was out there, somewhere, watching. The night was thick with tension as Sarah and her team advanced cautiously toward the warehouse. The dim glow of distant streetlights barely illuminated the rough concrete walls of the industrial complex. The silence was only broken by the sound of their footsteps, echoing in the stillness like a warning. Sarah's heart beat faster with each step. This was it. The moment they had been preparing for, the culmination of weeks of work, lies, and calculated risks. Mark was right beside her, his eyes scanning the surroundings, his hand tightly gripping his weapon. The others in the team, positioned in the shadows, stayed alert, their movements almost imperceptible as they made their way toward the warehouse entrance. Sarah felt a mix of anticipation and dread. She had been so sure of this plan, so confident that they were closing in on Tyner. But now, in the heavy silence of the night, doubts crept into her mind. What if they were wrong? What if this was another dead end? But there was no turning back now. They were committed. As they approached the entrance, they crouched behind a pile of rusted barrels, out of sight of the surveillance cameras. Sarah signaled for the team to halt. A soft whisper came through her earpiece from Jacobs, who was watching the warehouse from a distance. "Nothing unusual yet," Jacobs reported. "But there's been activity inside. A couple of vehicles went in just before you got here. One of them looked like it might belong to Tyner's men. We've got eyes on the place, but we don't know exactly what they're doing in there." Sarah's grip tightened on her radio as she signaled for the team to move forward. They crept silently, keeping low to the ground, moving toward the side entrance. It was a gamble, but if they could catch Tyner off guard, they might finally have him. They reached the door, and Mark motioned for Sarah to pause. He carefully inspected the lock. "Just a moment," he whispered. His fingers worked quickly, and in mere seconds, the lock clicked open. The door creaked as he eased it open, just enough for them to slip inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of oil and metal. They entered the warehouse cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the sound of the wind outside. The darkness was almost oppressive, but their night vision equipment lit the way, revealing stacks of crates and abandoned machinery in the dim light. Sarah's breath hitched as she signaled for everyone to spread out. They began to move silently through the warehouse, each member of the team using the cover of the industrial machinery to stay hidden from view. The faint sound of voices drifted through the silence, and Sarah motioned for the team to freeze. The voices were coming from deeper within the warehouse, but Sarah could not make out the words. They were too quiet. She could hear the low hum of machinery in the background. But there was something else. Something about the tone of the voices that made her stomach twist. She motioned for Mark to stay close. "Stay low and stay quiet," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to move fast. They could be on the move." Mark nodded, his jaw tight with focus, and they continued forward, inching closer to the sound. They rounded a corner, and suddenly, they saw them, two figures, standing under the flickering light of a lone bulb, speaking in hushed tones. Tyner. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. He was there, standing in front of her, just a few dozen feet away, as if the very man they had been hunting for months had been waiting for them to show up. But something was off. The men were discussing something, but the conversation seemed ordinary, casual, even. This wasn't the confrontation Sarah had imagined. This wasn't the final showdown she had been preparing for. The men were laughing, exchanging words that seemed so out of place in the cold, empty space of the warehouse. Sarah hesitated. Her pulse raced as she signaled for the team to hold their position. Something wasn't right. This was too easy. Then it clicked. The voice that had been echoing in her mind for weeks. The voice of her own caution, shouted inside her head. They had walked into a trap. In an instant, everything changed. The lights in the warehouse flickered, then went out. The entire space was plunged into complete darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she reached for her radio. But before she could make a sound, the noise of footsteps rushing towards them rang through the air. It wasn't just one or two men. It was a group, a large group. Then came the flash of gunfire. Sarah dove behind a stack of crates, her heart hammering in her chest. The bullets whizzed past her, ricocheting off the metal walls of the warehouse with a deafening clatter. Her mind raced. The plan had been to take Tyner by surprise, to catch him off guard, but now they were surrounded. "Move! Move!" Sarah shouted into her earpiece, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Get out of here now!" But the team was already under fire. Mark, who had been right behind her, ducked down as bullets slammed into the ground just inches from his feet. He scrambled to his feet, his face grim as he moved towards Sarah. "They know we're here," he yelled over the gunfire. "We need to regroup." Sarah could barely hear him over the roar of the shooting. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she signaled for Mark to fall back. But as they moved toward the exit, they realized with sinking hearts that their escape was blocked. The doors they had entered through were now guarded by two more men, weapons drawn. "Get down!" Mark shouted, grabbing Sarah by the arm and pulling her to the floor. The noise was deafening. Bullets cracked against the walls as the team huddled, trying to take cover. This wasn't just a simple gunfight. It was an ambush, one that Sarah had failed to see coming. And as the cold steel of her weapon met her trembling hands, she realized that the only way out was through. The sound of gunfire ricocheted off the walls, creating an almost surreal cacophony. Sarah's mind raced as the world around her seemed to slow down. Her thoughts raced, calculating the odds, considering her options, but all the while, her heart pounded in her chest, louder than the bullets that flew past her. "We need to get out now," Sarah shouted, her voice strained but commanding. Her hands gripped the weapon, steady despite the chaos. She glanced at Mark, who was crouched behind a stack of crates, his face grim as he reloaded his pistol. He nodded back to her, and without another word, they moved, a split-second decision that could cost them everything. "Go left," Mark barked, his eyes scanning the shadows for any movement. Sarah took a deep breath and, with her heart in her throat, bolted left, using the cover of large metal columns and crates to shield her from the incoming fire. The team followed behind her, every step a calculated risk. They had trained for moments like this, but nothing could prepare them for the ferocity of the attack they were facing now. Sarah's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as she sprinted, her legs burned with the effort, her body reacting before her brain could fully process the decision. The enemy was closing in. She could feel it. Feel their eyes on her. Feel the weight of the trap that had been set for them. They hadn't come to capture Tyner. They had come for her. She had walked straight into a death trap, and the walls were closing in. "Sarah, on your six." Mark's voice rang out in her earpiece, and she didn't need to turn around to know that the team was right behind her. They had to move fast. The sound of boots pounding the concrete floor behind her was unmistakable. The warehouse was a maze of shadows and danger, and with every step, she felt more and more cornered. They reached the far side of the warehouse, where a large rolling door led to an alleyway. It was their only shot at escape, but as Sarah reached for the door's handle, the worst possible scenario unfolded before her eyes. From the shadows stepped Tyner himself, a smug smile playing on his face as he slowly approached them, his gun casually resting in his hand. Well, Tyner's voice was smooth, like honey, but laced with menace. You really thought you could walk in here and take me down, didn't you, Sarah? You should have known better. You've been playing my game, but now it's my turn. A cold chill crept down Sarah's spine as she raised her weapon, pointing it at Tyner, but Tyner wasn't fazed. He stood there, motionless, as if he were the one in control. She could see the confidence in his eyes, the arrogance that had always been his trademark. He wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was a man who relished the power he held over others. Put the weapon down, Sarah, Tyner continued, his voice calm and measured. You're not going to win this fight. Not with me, not here. Sarah's heart raced, but her mind was clear. She was cornered. There was no escape, but there was still one option left. It was risky, dangerous even, but it was the only choice she had. Mark, she whispered urgently into her earpiece. On my count. Move fast. Mark didn't respond, but she knew he was ready. They had trained for moments like this, moments where everything depended on their ability to think on their feet and act as one. 3, 2, 1, Sarah whispered, and without waiting for the signal, she moved. In an instant, she dropped to the ground, using the momentum of her fall to roll behind the nearby crate, her gun still firmly in hand. At the same moment, Mark sprang from his cover, taking Tyner by surprise. The sound of a gunshot rang through the warehouse as the team began to fire in unison, their shots strategically placed to confuse and disorient their attackers. Tyner, caught off guard, barely had time to react. One of the team's shots grazed his arm, and he hissed in pain, stumbling backward. But he quickly regained his composure, and before Sarah could fire again, he fired a round into the air, the deafening crack of the shot shattering the already fragile calm of the night. Enough! Tyner bellowed, his voice dripping with rage. You think you can outsmart me? You think you're in control? But Sarah wasn't listening to him. She was already on the move, moving to the far side of the warehouse, her team following her every step. It wasn't about confronting Tyner face to face. It was about getting out of there, staying alive, and using the chaos to their advantage. Move now, Sarah barked, as she grabbed a large metal pipe off the ground and hurled it toward the entrance, creating a diversion that sent several of Tyner's men scrambling for cover. Mark was right behind her, firing off a few more rounds to keep the enemies distracted. They darted toward the alleyway, the heavy steel door scraping open with a deafening screech. But just as they were about to slip through, the door slammed shut. Tyner had anticipated their escape route, and the sound of his men pushing the door back into place was chilling. Sarah turned to face her team, her pulse hammering in her ears. They were trapped in a dead-end alley with no way out. Change of plan? Sarah muttered, her voice steady despite the fear tightening in her chest. She turned to Mark, who had a grim look on his face. We push forward now. With nowhere to go, they sprinted toward the far end of the alley, their movements fast and precise. The gunfire continued to echo behind them as Tyner's men chased them down. But they were relentless. The only way out was to fight for it. They reached the end of the alley, where a small ladder led up to the rooftop of the adjacent building. Mark went first, climbing with practiced speed, while Sarah covered him. The sounds of heavy footsteps grew closer, and Sarah could feel the tension rising, knowing the risk they were taking. But she didn't hesitate. She grabbed the ladder and started to climb. Each step felt like a lifetime, but she didn't look down. The only thing that mattered now was getting to the top, getting to safety. As she reached the top, Mark helped pull her up, and they crouched low, hidden from view. But Tyner wasn't done yet. You can't escape. His voice echoed from the street below. I'm going to find you, Sarah. You can't run from me forever. Sarah's eyes narrowed, and she exhaled slowly. She knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sarah and Mark crouched low on the rooftop, barely daring to breathe. The dim glow of the streetlights below cast long shadows, and the sounds of Tyner's men searching the alley echoed up to them. Each footstep, each shout from the street, sent a wave of adrenaline surging through Sarah's veins. They had made it to the roof, but the battle was far from over. "Mark, we need to move," Sarah whispered, her voice low and urgent. "We can't stay here, we need to take the fight to them. We don't have much time." Mark nodded, his jaw clenched in grim determination. "I know, we need a plan." Sarah glanced at the building they were perched on. It was a 3-story structure, and the rooftop was relatively flat, offering little cover, but beyond it, another building rose higher, an abandoned structure that was a perfect vantage point for a sniper. "That's our way out," Sarah said, pointing to the next rooftop. "We need to get across the building. There's a sniper position there. We can use it to cover our escape." Mark's eyes followed the line she pointed to, calculating the risks. It was a leap, literally and figuratively, but it was their only chance. The alternative was being trapped on the rooftop, surrounded by Tyner's men with nowhere to run. "All right," Mark said, gripping his gun tighter. "Let's do it." Together, they carefully made their way across the narrow ledge between the two buildings. The drop below seemed to widen the farther they went, but Sarah kept her focus on the next move. Her hands were steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She couldn't afford to falter. Not now. As they reached the edge of the building, Mark glanced over at Sarah. "Ready?" "Always," she replied, her voice unwavering. In one swift motion, they jumped, each of them landing with practiced precision on the next rooftop. The impact reverberated through Sarah's body, but she pushed the pain aside. They had no time to waste as they scrambled to their feet. Sarah heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. The city was waking up to the chaos they had unleashed, but that was a double-edged sword. While it might slow down Tyner's men, it could also bring more authorities into the mix. No, Sarah thought this had to end tonight. They moved swiftly across the rooftop, crouching low behind debris and air conditioning units for cover. The sniper's position loomed ahead, and Sarah felt a flicker of hope rise inside her. With the right vantage point, they could start taking out Tyner's men one by one. But Tyner was no fool, he was closing in. They reached the sniper's perch and found it empty, just as they had hoped. But Sarah knew that Tyner wouldn't leave anything to chance. He would be expecting them to use this position for cover. "Mark, take the left side. I'll cover the right," Sarah ordered, her voice sharp as steel. "We need to take them out before they even know what hit them." Mark gave her a quick nod and moved to the left side of the roof. Sarah crouched behind the sniper's gear, pulling the heavy rifle into her hands. It was a quick calculation. Her pulse steady, her breath controlled. She peered through the scope, eyes scanning the street below. A flash of movement, a dark figure slipping through the alley. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, precise and deadly. The figure collapsed, and for a moment, there was a silence, an eerie stillness that hung in the air, but it didn't last long. Tyner's men scattered, shouting in panic, but Sarah was already taking aim again. She could hear them calling out orders, trying to organize, but it was too late. They were too exposed, too vulnerable now that Sarah had the high ground. "Got another one," Mark's voice echoed from the other side of the roof. Sarah shot again, her second target falling to the ground in a heap. With every shot, her confidence grew, but so did the danger. She knew that the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely Tyner's remaining men would get wise to their position. "We need to move now," Sarah shouted, pushing the sniper rifle aside and drawing her sidearm. "They're regrouping. We don't want to be here when they come back with backup." Mark, already on his feet, darted toward the far side of the roof. Sarah followed closely behind, keeping her gun aimed at the retreating figures below. She could see the panic in their eyes as they tried to retreat into the alleyways. But it wasn't just the gunmen they had to worry about anymore. "Sarah, look!" Mark shouted. She turned to see a large black SUV screeching around the corner, tires squealing on the wet pavement. It came to a halt just below them, and out stepped none other than Tyner himself. Well, well, well. Tyner's voice echoed up to them, the smugness dripping from his every word. You really think you can escape me? Sarah's pulse quickened, her fingers tightening around her gun. They had been so close. They had made it this far only to find themselves face to face with Tyner himself. He raised his weapon with unnerving calm, but Sarah wasn't about to let him win. She sprang into action, pushing Mark out of the way as she took a shot, her bullet narrowly missing Tyner's shoulder. He ducked just in time, a smile still playing on his lips. I always knew you were a fighter, Sarah, he called out, stepping back behind the SUV, using it as cover. But it's over. You're surrounded. You've run out of time. Sarah gritted her teeth, moving quickly to the edge of the roof. The fight wasn't over yet, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of options. There had to be another way. There had to be something they were missing. Mark, we need to end this, Sarah said, her voice low and deadly. It's time we make our move. We need to take Tyner down for good. No more running. Mark nodded, a grim determination on his face as he turned his gaze toward Tyner. Let's do this. They both stood, weapons ready, preparing for the final showdown with the man who had been a step ahead of them all this time. Tyner's laughter echoed through the night, a cold and arrogant sound that grated against Sarah's resolve. She could feel the heat of the moment, her blood pumping faster as the final confrontation loomed closer. They had come so far, fought so hard, and yet, here they were, facing the very man they had been trying to escape for weeks. Do you think I'll just let you walk away? Tyner's voice boomed from behind the SUV, his tone dripping with mockery. You're nothing but ants trying to stand against a hurricane. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to take the shot, wanted to end it right here, right now, but Tyner was clever. Too clever. He was hiding behind the vehicle, and though he had exposed himself for just a moment, Sarah knew better than to rush. He wouldn't give up so easily. Mark, we can't waste time. If we're going to do this, we need to hit him now, Sarah said, her voice steady but with an underlying urgency. Mark, crouching low behind a large air conditioning unit on the roof, nodded. His grip tightened around his weapon as he peeked over the edge of the roof, trying to get a better shot at Tyner. I'll take the right side, he said, his voice low. We can trap him, just keep him distracted. Sarah didn't need any more words. She already knew what needed to be done. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Tyner's men were scattered below, but the true danger was still hiding behind the vehicle. Every second they waited brought them closer to being overwhelmed by the rest of his forces. Tyner had always been ruthless, and now, with the tables turning, he wasn't going to make this easy. Sarah gave Mark a quick, sharp nod before sprinting toward the edge of the roof. Her feet pounding across the gravel, Tyner's eyes flicked up, spotting her as she moved. He raised his weapon instinctively, but Sarah was faster. She dove to the side, rolling behind a large HVAC unit just as the first shots rang out. The bullets whizzed past her, too close for comfort. She could feel the burn of the air as the projectiles flew, narrowly missing their mark. Damn it! Tyner shouted, frustrated by her speed. You think you're the only one with a plan? Sarah peeked out from behind cover, her eyes scanning the street below for Mark. He was already moving into position, slipping between shadows with the stealth of a predator. Tyner's men had retreated into the alley, regrouping, but Sarah knew they wouldn't stay back for long. They were trying to outflank them, force them into a corner. But that wasn't going to happen, not if Sarah could help it. Mark! She shouted, her voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire. Get ready! Mark didn't respond with words, but Sarah saw him raise his weapon. He'd positioned himself perfectly across the roof, a few buildings down, in a place where he could have a clear line of sight at Tyner's position. It was now or never. The trap was set. Taking a deep breath, Sarah poked her head out from behind cover just as Tyner stood from behind the SUV, raising his weapon to take aim at her. His smile had returned, twisted and cruel. You're too predictable, Sarah, he taunted, a sickening grin spreading across his face. You were always too reckless, You should have stayed out of this, or better yet, died with your little friend." His words hit her like a slap in the face, but Sarah didn't flinch. She fired first, her bullet finding its mark as Tyner stumbled back, his arm jerking from the impact, but it wasn't a fatal shot. It only grazed his shoulder. Tyner growled in pain, but that didn't stop him. He fired back in retaliation, the sound of his gunshots sharp and deafening in the night. But Sarah was already on the move. Using her surroundings to her advantage, she ducked low, weaving between cover, closing the distance. "Sarah!" Mark's voice suddenly crackled through her earpiece. "Urgent. Now!" "He's distracted." Sarah didn't need to hear more. She darted forward, her eyes locked on Tyner's back. She could see the surprise on his face as he turned, realizing just how close she was. But it was too late. In one fluid motion, Sarah leapt forward, tackling Tyner to the ground. They collided hard, the air forced from her lungs, but she didn't care. She had him. She could feel his body twisting beneath hers, trying to fight her off, but she kept her grip tight. The desperation in his movements only fueled her determination. "Stay down!" she spat, her voice low, but with a fierce power that made Tyner freeze for just a moment. His face twisted with fury, and he attempted to bring his weapon up, but Sarah slammed her knee into his chest, knocking the gun from his hand. His eyes burned with rage, and for a moment, it seemed like time stood still as they struggled for control. Then, Mark's voice came through again, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Sarah, we don't have much time. Backup is coming." Sarah's heart raced. She couldn't afford to keep fighting Tyner like this. She had to end it, now. With a sudden, brutal force, Sarah pushed herself off Tyner, drawing her own gun. He was still gasping for breath, trying to regain his bearings, but Sarah didn't hesitate. The gunshot was loud, echoing off the buildings, but it was followed by an agonizing silence. Tyner's body went still, his eyes glazed over in disbelief. The fight was over, but the war? That was far from done. The courtroom fell into a tense, almost unbearable silence as the jury deliberated. The weight of the trial, the evidence, and the emotional testimony from both the prosecution and defense seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. Ethan sat at the defense table, his posture rigid and unmoving, as though he were trying to freeze time. He stared ahead, his mind racing in endless circles. The smirk that had once been his trademark had long since disappeared, replaced by a cold and calculating expression. The guilty verdict seemed inevitable. He knew it. The prosecution had presented a clear, unassailable case. The confession, his lack of remorse, the damning forensic evidence, and his mother's devastating testimony had all pointed to one thing. Ethan Walker was a murderer, but that reality didn't sit well with him. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms, and now, for the first time in his life, he was on the receiving end of the consequences. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, a small flicker of hope still lingered within Ethan. It was a hope born from arrogance, a belief that he could outwit anyone, even the justice system. Perhaps, he thought, the jury would see him for what he truly was. A misunderstood genius, a product of his environment. Maybe they would pity him, see him as a lost cause, a boy who had been broken by his upbringing. As the minutes stretched into hours, Ethan's thoughts became increasingly disjointed. His heart pounded in his chest, a strange mix of anticipation and dread filling him with a sense of helplessness. He hated the feeling. He had never been powerless before, but now, in this moment, as the fate of his future hung in the balance, he could not escape it. Across the room, Amelia Sanchez, David Campbell's sister, sat with her husband. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She had spent months reliving the horror of her brother's murder. She had witnessed the brutality of Ethan's actions, had heard his smug, callous words, and had been forced to endure the coldness that emanated from him like a toxic cloud. The last few weeks had been an emotional roller coaster, a constant struggle to reconcile the brother she had known with the monster who had taken his life. Now, sitting in the courtroom, Waiting for the verdict, Amelia felt as though she were living in a nightmare. Her heart ached for David, for the senselessness of his death, and for the absence of any remorse in Ethan's behavior. He had never shown a single sign of empathy, of sorrow. The smug, indifferent young man in the courtroom was not the child she had once known. The man who had taken her brother's life was not someone she could ever understand. The jury's return was inevitable. The tension in the courtroom reached its breaking point as the bailiff stood and called for the jury to enter. The air seemed to crackle with anticipation. Every eye fixed on the door as it swung open. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged man with an expression of grave seriousness, walked to the front of the courtroom. His hands trembled slightly as he handed the verdict to the clerk. The room held its breath as the clerk began to read. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Walker, guilty of aggravated murder." A wave of quiet relief washed over the Campbell family. Amelia clutched her husband's hand tightly, her tears flowing freely. It wasn't justice. It couldn't bring David back. But it was something. It was a small piece of closure in a world that had been turned upside down. As the clerk continued, the words echoed in Ethan's mind. He could feel the walls closing in around him. Guilty. The word repeated in his thoughts, each repetition ringing louder than the last. The gravity of it began to settle in, a weight that pressed down on him with an overwhelming finality. Count 1, guilty. Count 2, guilty. The verdict was clear. Ethan would pay for his actions. The jury's verdict echoed in Ethan's mind as he sat still at the defense table, the heavy weight of reality beginning to settle upon him. He had expected this moment, had prepared for it in the same way he had prepared for every challenge in his life. Calmly, with an arrogance that had shielded him for so long. But this moment, the one he had always believed would go in his favor, felt different. There was something undeniably final about it. His smirk, once a fixture on his face, was now absent, replaced by a cold and unwavering expression of resignation. In the days following the trial, Ethan found himself in a state of utter disillusionment, the life he had once taken for granted. The life in which he had been in control of every situation, every conversation, every outcome, had unraveled beyond his comprehension. He had built a fortress of indifference around himself, constructing a persona that he believed would protect him from any consequence. But as the days bled into each other, Ethan came to realize that he was no longer the untouchable boy who could manipulate everyone around him with a flick of his finger. His future, once a blank canvas awaiting his grand plans, was now a prison. His once sharp mind, always quick to find an out, was now sluggish with the weight of reality. He had to admit, even to himself, that there was no way out of this, the confession, the damning forensic evidence, and worst of all, his own behavior during the trial had sealed his fate. He had alienated everyone, from the jury to his own defense attorney, Michael Clark, the seasoned lawyer who had tried his best to mitigate the damage, had been completely undone by Ethan's own arrogance. His behavior, his unrepentant smirks, and his defiance had turned what should have been a battle for a reduced sentence into an inescapable downfall. Ethan spent the next few days in a haze. His mind raced as he lay in his prison cell, the walls closing in around him. The prison, once a distant reality he had dismissed as something that happened to lesser people, had become his new home. Every sound, the rattling of the bars, the distant shouts, the clang of metal doors, reminded him of the irreversible path he had chosen. It felt surreal, almost impossible, that he was the one who had to face this. He had always been the one watching, the one making decisions, not the one suffering the consequences. His first few nights in prison were marked by a strange mix of disbelief and numbness. Ethan knew he had been a monster, but he had never fully understood the weight of that word until now. There was no escaping it. No one here cared about his arrogance or his intellect in this place. He was just another inmate, bound by the same rules and the same fate as everyone else. The realization hit him harder than any physical blow. He was nobody now. The mornings in prison were cold, the thin blankets offering little comfort against the chill. The prison guards were indifferent to him, their faces impassive as they passed by his cell. There was no recognition in their eyes, no acknowledgement of the young man who had once been the center of attention in a courtroom. Ethan had been a spectacle, a symbol of a twisted type of privilege, and now, here in the sterile, claustrophobic confines of his cell, he was just another face in a sea of countless others. Despite this, Ethan's mind refused to fully accept what had happened. It was as though he was in denial, clinging to the faintest shred of hope that something, anything, could change. He began to formulate plans, his mind working overtime as he thought of ways to escape, ways to regain control. Could he appeal the verdict? Could he convince someone, anyone, that he was misunderstood, that he had been a victim of circumstance? The thought of spending the rest of his life here, in this suffocating cage, was unthinkable to him. But as the days turned into weeks, and his life in prison became more routine, Ethan started to realize that there was no escape from his fate. His arrogance, the very trait that had once served him so well, now served as his own prison. He had alienated his family, his defense team, and anyone who might have helped him. The long hours of solitary confinement were punctuated by moments of clarity, moments when the full weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him with a cold, relentless truth. There would be no redemption for him, not in the way he had always imagined. Every day, Ethan could feel his sense of self disintegrating. His mind, once sharp and full of grandiose plans, was now clouded with regret. He had tried to convince himself that he was above it all, that he could manipulate any situation to his advantage, but in the end, there was nothing he could do to change the irreversible consequences of his actions. The people he had hurt, the lives he had destroyed, the family he had torn apart. None of it could be undone. The only thing left for him now was the cold, harsh reality of life behind bars. Ethan's arrogance had always been his armor, but now it was his greatest weakness. He had spent so long pretending that he was invincible, that the consequences of his actions would never touch him, that he had failed to prepare for the moment when the armor would crack, and when it did, it shattered completely. In the prison yard, Ethan found himself in a strange, unfamiliar world. The other inmates were not impressed by his past, his wealth, or his manipulative intelligence. They did not care who he was before the trial here. He was nothing more than another prisoner. The whispers of his trial followed him wherever he went, a reminder that the world now knew him not as a privileged young man with a bright future, but as a convicted murderer, sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. He had no allies here. He was no longer the center of attention, no longer the one everyone looked to for answers. The world outside had moved on, and Ethan, in his own mind, had been left behind. His mother, too, had distanced herself from him, unable to continue protecting the son she had raised. The weight of her testimony had crushed any semblance of hope he had left. Her words had been the final blow, the moment when she had torn away the last layer of his carefully constructed identity. Now, as he sat in his cell, Ethan found himself thinking about the past more and more, the friends he had lost, the family he had alienated, the choices he had made that had led him here. He realized, with a sense of hopelessness, that he had been given every opportunity to change, to live a different life, but he had squandered it all. His brilliance had been wasted on self-destruction. The prison walls seemed to close in tighter with every passing day, but it was the realization of his own insignificance that hurt the most. The boy who had once believed he could control everything, who had always been able to manipulate and bend others to his will, was now just another inmate, forgotten and ignored by the world outside. As the days turned to months, Ethan's thoughts became darker. The idea of spending the rest of his life in prison, alone and broken, began to settle in his mind. But still, the arrogance that had defined him refused to die completely. Even in the face of his defeat, he held on to the belief that he was somehow different, that he was still capable of outsmarting the system, of finding a way to turn things around. But deep down, a small, quiet voice whispered the truth he had been trying to deny all along. There was no escape from this. His life, as he had known it, was over, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Ethan's first few months in prison were marked by confusion and inner turmoil. The outside world, the world where he had once been someone important, someone who held power and influence, felt like a distant memory. All that remained now was the harsh, monotonous routine of prison life. Every day bled into the next, a blur of gray walls, hard beds, and the clanging of metal doors. The guards, once just figures in the background of his life, now loomed larger than life. They were the bearers of power in this new, suffocating world, but Ethan's arrogance had not yet been fully crushed. He still viewed himself as above it all, as someone who could outsmart the system just as he had outsmarted everyone before. He would play the game, he told himself, and eventually, he would find a way to turn things around. The idea of being confined to a small cell for the rest of his life didn't seem real to him. It couldn't be real. At first, the prison was like a stage, a place where he could act out his usual roles. The aloof, intelligent young man who stood apart from the rest, he quickly learned how to navigate the prison hierarchy, using his charm and wit to manipulate the other inmates. He wasn't popular, not by any means, but he knew how to avoid trouble. He kept his head down, stayed quiet, and watched those around him like a hawk. Every move he made, every word he spoke was calculated. He still thought he could outsmart this place, find a way to bend the rules to his will. But the reality of prison was relentless. There were no opportunities for self-aggrandizement, no classrooms full of students waiting for his wisdom, no admiration from peers or superiors. In prison, there were only walls, bars, and an unrelenting, unforgiving system that had no use for people like Ethan. He was just another young man who had crossed the line, and now he was paying the price. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Ethan's routine became a prison of its own. Breakfast, work, lunch, shower time, more work, dinner, lights out. It was the same every single day. The small moments of rebellion, the flickers of hope that had once kept him going, slowly began to dim. The guards, the inmates, even the occasional visits from his lawyer or his family. None of it brought any relief. And then, in one of his more rare moments of clarity, Ethan began to think about his crime. About David Campbell, the murder, the violence, the brutality, the way he had walked into a man's home. A man who had never done anything to him, and ended his life in a fit of bored, senseless rage. Ethan had justified it in his mind back then. He had told himself it was about power, about control, that he had been in control of everything. From the moment he picked up that knife to the moment he made his confession, he had been a victim. He had told himself, a product of his upbringing and his surroundings. He had never thought about the real consequences of his actions, the blood, the screams, the broken family, the fact that David Campbell was never coming back. None of that had truly registered with him until now. At night, when the world fell silent and the prison became a cold, dark place, Ethan would lie in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The thoughts would flood in. The faces of the Campbell family. The image of David Campbell's lifeless body, sprawled out on the living room floor. Amelia Sanchez, David's sister, sitting in that courtroom, her heart broken, her entire world shattered by Ethan's actions. And yet, even then, Ethan didn't feel remorse. Not in the way the world expected him to. Not in the way his mother had wanted him to. He didn't feel sorrow for David Campbell, or for the family he had destroyed. Instead, he felt a gnawing emptiness, a sensation that told him that perhaps, deep down, he was not the person he had always believed himself to be. He was not the master manipulator, the brilliant young man who had all the answers. He was just nothing. Prison had stripped him of everything, his wealth, his freedom, his future, and even his arrogance had started to fade, replaced by something far worse. An existential void. He wasn't even sure who he was anymore. The boy who had walked into that courtroom with a smirk, confident that he was invincible, was now nothing more than a shadow of himself. The next few weeks were a blur of loneliness and quiet contemplation. Ethan began to withdraw from the world around him. He refused to interact with other inmates, preferring the isolation of his cell. He spent hours just staring at the walls, reflecting on everything that had happened. But the more he thought about it, the more the truth became undeniable. There was no escape. No one was coming to save him. He wasn't going to be the hero of his own story. He wasn't even the villain. He was simply a boy who had made the wrong choices and now had to live with them. His mother, Elizabeth Walker, had tried to reach him during her visits, but Ethan had no words for her. The woman who had enabled him for so many years, who had sheltered him from the consequences of his actions, had finally been forced to confront the reality of who he had become. She had seen him for what he truly was, a monster, and the guilt that weighed on her was heavier than anything Ethan could have ever imagined. Elizabeth's final words to him echoed in his mind. "I failed you, Ethan. I failed you as a mother." At first, Ethan had refused to acknowledge them, pushing her words aside as just another sign of weakness. But as the days stretched on, as the silence of prison seeped deeper into his bones, those words began to haunt him. They were the final nail in the coffin of his former self. His mother, the one person who had always been there to protect him, had now seen him for what he was, and the realization shattered whatever illusion he had left about his own importance. Ethan's world was shrinking. The more he thought about his past, about the choices he had made, the more he came to understand the enormity of the consequences. There was no way to undo what he had done. He had taken a life, and in return, his own life had been taken from him, and there would be no getting it back. In this place, in this void of time and space, Ethan came to understand something that had once been completely alien to him. He would never be the person he once was, the man who had walked into that courtroom with a cocky grin. The boy who had believed the world owed him everything was gone. All that remained was a shell, a broken individual with no future and no hope of redemption. Months passed, each one stretching endlessly for Ethan as he continued to serve his sentence in the cold, unforgiving prison. In the beginning, he had fought against the monotony, using whatever small means he could to cling to his sense of identity. But over time, even his fierce pride and arrogant self-importance began to erode under the weight of his confinement. His body and mind, once filled with the vigor of rebellion, now moved with the slow, methodical exhaustion of someone who had lost the will to fight. Ethan's reflection in the small prison mirror was hardly recognizable to him anymore. His once neat, styled hair was now a tangled mess, and his face had grown gaunt, hollow with the absence of life and purpose. His sharp eyes, which had once gleamed with defiance, were now dull, no longer possessing the same spark of arrogance that had so captivated those around him. He wasn't sure what was worse, the crushing loneliness or the creeping realization that no one cared to see him anymore. The world outside had long since forgotten Ethan Walker, the teenage murderer who had once seemed so invincible. His name was nothing but a fleeting shadow in the media, mentioned only when people wanted to remember the horror of his crime. But this was all he had left. Prison, the smell of metal, the cold stone walls, the clicking of boots echoing down long, sterile hallways, the sight of inmates whose faces blurred into faceless, indistinguishable figures. These were the things that now filled his life. He had no future to look forward to, no dreams of redemption, no hopes of leaving this place someday. Ethan had been sentenced to life without parole. There would be no second chance, no courtroom drama, no hero's return. And so, day after day, the bitterness inside him grew. He couldn't shake the thought of his past, the moments when he had been free, before the murder, before the trial, before the confession. He had been a teenager, full of arrogance and a belief that he could outsmart anyone and everyone. It had all seemed so easy back then. He was Ethan Walker, the boy who could bend the world to his will, but now all those illusions had shattered, and the cold, harsh reality of his situation loomed over him, mocking him. As time dragged on, Ethan's mind began to wander. He replayed his crime over and over, but it no longer felt like the reckless act of a bored teenager. It felt like something deeper, something darker, the violence, the brutality, the lack of any real reason for it all. He began to understand, if only in fragments, that there had been no grand reason for his actions. There had been no tragic backstory that could explain it. No broken home or abusive father to blame, no neglected childhood to justify the murder. The truth was simple, painful, and undeniable. He had killed because he could. David Campbell had been nothing to him, just another person in the world who happened to cross his path. Ethan had entered that home, a man-child who was used to getting what he wanted, and taken that man's life with no more care than he would have shown an insect on the sidewalk. And in the end, David Campbell had been the one who paid the price for Ethan's emptiness, his coldness, and his cruelty. Ethan had destroyed the life of a man who had done nothing wrong, a man whose only crime had been to exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. The victim wasn't just David Campbell, it was the Campbell family, it was the entire community of Westerville, and it was even Ethan himself who had become a hollow shell of the person he might have been. Ethan didn't know when he began to feel the weight of this realization. It was subtle at first, like the slow erosion of a stone in a river. He had been too focused on himself, too obsessed with his own self-perceived brilliance, to notice that what he had done to David Campbell was beyond any sort of rational explanation. The moment he had killed, everything he had ever known had shattered, and no matter how much he tried to deny it, the pieces would never come back together. Months of solitary reflection had brought him to a point where he could no longer ignore the truth. For so long, he had refused to face the aftermath of his actions, had tried to convince himself that he wasn't a monster, that he wasn't a murderer. But now, in the quiet confines of his prison cell, he knew it. He was exactly what they had called him all along, a killer. Yet, the hardest part was not the fact of his crime. It was the aftermath, the pain he had caused, not just to his victim, but to his own family. Elizabeth, his mother, who had once defended him blindly, had once held on to the hope that there was something redeemable in him, had now seen him for what he was. She had tried to love him into being a better person. But in the end, she had failed. She had become a victim in this story, too. Ethan could only think of one thing when he thought of his mother's face. The look of devastation and betrayal when she had finally realized that her son was not the boy she had always hoped for. The guilt he felt about this was suffocating. And for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't know how to escape it. He had destroyed her, just as he had destroyed everything else he had touched. As the years went by, Ethan's mental state deteriorated further. The hope he had once clung to, the idea that he would be able to somehow redeem himself, faded. His arrogant, self-centered attitude had gradually given way to resignation. He would never leave prison. He would never be free. There would be no second chance, no redemption. He was a ghost, a shadow of what he had once been, doomed to live out his days in a cell, paying for the crime that had changed everything. The realization that he would never again see the world outside those prison walls felt like a heavy shackle around his heart. He thought back to the last few months before the crime, when life still felt like it was ahead of him. But those days were gone. They had vanished the moment he decided to take someone else's life, and all that was left was the slow, inevitable march toward the end. Ethan's story, the story of a young man who had once believed he could escape the consequences of his actions, was over. It was over not because of the justice system or the prison walls, but because Ethan had lost something far more important. His humanity. He had sold it for a fleeting moment of power, and in doing so had condemned himself to a life of endless, eternal isolation. And as the years stretched on, Ethan Walker sat in his cell, alone, silent, a broken man who had once believed he was invincible. The world had forgotten him, and in a way, perhaps that was the greatest punishment of all.